and welcome everyone to this episode of Breakpoint. The topic for today is attack in your backyard. MITRE ATT&CK has been the go-to framework for both offensive and defensive security teams. Its sophistication and vast coverage makes it quite comprehensive, often not easy to fathom, let alone implement to the fullest. The guest for today is Shweta Kshirsagar, BISO and Head of Cyber Defense, MITRE Designs. She has 18 years of experience in cybersecurity domains such as incident response, data protection, privacy, information security audits, and compliance. Hi, I'm Neelu, a technical security enthusiast and your host. I welcome you to the Breakpoint Security Podcast. In this podcast, we'll explore the depths of defensive security. We learn the methods and techniques that the smart security teams are using to solve practical security challenges today and innovate their way into the future. Welcome to Breakpoint, Shweta.
Thank you very much, Neelu, for having me. And I'm sure this is going to be a very interesting topic of discussion, which many experts in the industry are talking about. And a lot of cyber defense team, I see they are implementing and working on this framework.
Yeah, I think I'm also looking forward to it. And when I heard about your work in this area and, I think in some other conferences as well, the first thing that came to my mind was, there are so many certifications and so many frameworks when you talk about information security.
Right.
What made you actually go for the MITRE framework? And I mean, I was just thinking of why you wanted to adopt it in the first place.
Right. So yes, there are definitely a lot of frameworks like Stride or PASTA or the very famous Lockheed Martin's cyber kill chain. Then there is Diamond model of intrusion analysis, etc. But then in my opinion, the MITRE ATT&CK framework offers the most comprehensive, I would say a common book of knowledge about the attackers' tactics, techniques, and procedures. It details all these TTPs, not just at the enterprise infrastructure level, but they have also extended to the, ICS and mobile infrastructure as well in 3 different matrices. Now, coming to the framework itself, I think in the current version, which is the version 13.1, the TTPs that MITRE provides consists of, or they cover at least 138 groups, if I remember correctly. And they have included 41 data sources that the cyber defenders can use to ensure that they get the correct security log information into their SIM, and using which they are able to build the detection logic using these events so as to address these scenarios and tactics which the attackers used, or we see the attackers using in many different attacks. Apart from this, MITRE also provides more than, I would say, 100 mitigations across all these different 3 matrices, which we can use to prevent successful execution of a particular technique or a sub-technique by an attacker during the attack phase. Coming to the ATT&CK's first version, if I remember correctly, it was launched way back in 2018. Whereas the current version is 13.0, 13.1, which was launched in April of this year. Now, what this means is every single year in the last 4 to 5 years, I have seen that MITRE has launched at least 2 revisions or 2 versions. And that includes, every version includes TTPs which are latest and which we have seen in different attack scenarios. And, these continuous revisions and updates of the TTPs that MITRE brings in, it makes it very, very comprehensive. And therefore, I would say it's not just a best choice only for the cyber security operations center, but incident responders, application security testing teams, or even the GRC team, governance, risk and compliance teams, can use it as part of their day-to-day activities. So it's basically about the comprehensiveness, the detailing of the techniques, tactics, and the depth of information that MITRE framework provides, which I think is very, very valuable to understand the attack patterns and behavior.
Yeah, well said. Actually, there are, hundreds of techniques, and I think they definitely try to stay updated as much as possible with the real attacks that happen. But then, there is a reason why, like you just mentioned yourself, there's a reason why most organizations or many organizations are not able to adopt this framework fully and easily. And in my understanding, it's also to do with the comprehensiveness of it. Like, for example, you need to understand in the right spirit, in the right sense, first of all, from an attacker's perspective, what does that mean from a defender's perspective? There are a lot of operational details to understand, a lot of correlation that goes behind the scenes. So understanding it itself, I think, can be a challenge for any average security team. So how do you tackle that? Because I think that would be your first stage, even before actually going for the implementation.
Yes, absolutely right, Neelu. Understanding the framework itself was a bigger challenge for me as well. So when MITRE launched their version, I think version 7 way back in 2019, that is where my journey with MITRE started. So me and my team, we started thinking about how do we, kind of look at MITRE, how do we approach MITRE, how do we read MITRE, and it all started from there. And I still remember at that point of time, MITRE attack framework had two different parts in the enterprise metrics itself. It was called as the pre-attack and attack. And at that point of time, attack consisted of, I think, 12 tactics and 185 unique techniques, and somewhere close to 230 or 235 unique sub-techniques. And when we looked at the pre-attack, what made sense for us is to include recon-related tactics from the pre-attack, and then cover all the tactics, from the enterprise attack. That's where we started. And I think I still remember at that time, there were very few security vendors who mapped their detection or prevention capabilities to the attack framework. We had to take a complete manual approach where a lot of work was done in Microsoft Excel. We prepared our own methodology on how do we map these detections and prevention capabilities that we have across the different security controls in our security stack, and get a comprehensive view of our environment vis-a-vis this framework. And that's how the journey started. So I would just like to also talk about a little bit of the quantitative analysis about the framework. I think this is one area where not many of us really spend time, because if we spend time, you will understand what is the quantum of work that we have to do when we start the implementation. So if you look at the number of tactics and sub-techniques that, MITRE has, this is, how it looks. So what I've done is I have used the same approach that I followed for version 7. And I have tried the version 13.1 analysis using the same approach.
Okay.
So when you look at attack version 13.1, you have total number of techniques under 14 tactics. Okay. The total number of techniques is 227. Okay. The total number of sub-techniques within these techniques is 558. Okay. Now, these are the techniques and sub-techniques which are spread across, 14 tactics. Now, there is no segregation as pre-attack and attack like we had way back in version 7. Now, out of these total number, there are unique number of techniques and sub-techniques. Okay, so there are 196 techniques and 411 sub-techniques which are unique. Okay, what this means is that there are 31 techniques which are repeated in these 14 tactics. There are 147 sub-techniques which are also repeated as part of this, techniques and tactics. Okay. Now, from the implementation point of view, I would prefer to consider a unique number because the numbers become less, and you are able to break down into achievable milestones. Okay. And detections, when you build the detections, these detections should be implemented at the sub-technique level, so that we are able to complete the chain right from tactics, techniques, and sub-techniques. Okay. And we get a complete view of the attack pattern or attack scenario if we address the complete chain. Now, there are, I think, around 90 or 92 unique techniques that do not have sub-techniques in MITRE. That is also a case. Okay. And in such cases, the detections will be limited at the techniques level. Another point to add here is that there are 17 techniques which appear at least, I would say 2 to 4 times in 5 different tactics. Okay. So just to give you an example, there is a technique called valid account, which appears 4 times in different tactics, which is initial access, persistence, privilege escalation, and defense evasion. So what happens is, when you are unable to understand where is the overlap, what is the unique number of techniques and sub-techniques I have to implement, doing this quantitative analysis helps to divide or break down the work and focus on the milestones which are achievable. So that's been our approach also when we started the implementation way back in 2019 in my previous organization.
So the duplicate techniques that you're talking about, just and I was just thinking about it, is this standardized, or every organization interprets it differently?
No, these are standardized. These are pretty much standardized. In fact, I have downloaded version 13.1 in the Excel format and tried to identify which are the duplicate ones, like valid account. When you look at valid account, if you are able to cover valid account as a technique, and I think it has got another 4 or 5 sub techniques. If you cover valid account under initial access, okay, it means you are covering it against persistence, privilege escalation.
For all, everything. Yeah. Okay. That's great. I think that's giving a very clear picture in the mind for, for our listeners to understand how did you start with the approach. But so for example, we are in a state, in a good state where the entire team has the clarity of what's going on, how we are interpreting the framework, and everyone is on the same page with this. How did you go about the actual implementation? Because there's so many components to this, right, that can play a role here. For example, there can be multiple sources of data collection itself. Like there may not be a single source of data collection, and then you might need to prioritize based on how frequently some technique is occurring, because there has to be a point where you start. And then you might also need to track. So there are a lot of things that come to mind when we think about actual implementation of this, even though we may have now a reduced number of non-duplicate items to look at.
Yes.
So how did you go about the implementation?
So see, we started with the manual mapping of the existing rules in the SIM. Okay, so we had out-of-the-box rules enabled in the SIM, as well as certain detection rules that were customized to our environments. Okay, so the very first step that we took was we said, let's start with the SIM detection rules and see what is our coverage with respect to how many tactics and sub-techniques we cover. Okay, now I think if I remember correctly, we mapped more than 300 detection rules to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and it took around 8 to 10 months of hard work, teamwork.
Oh, wow.
And in some cases, rework also to complete the mapping. And the output of this mapping was very valuable for us. We kind of identified what are the different attack scenarios that our existing rules do not cover, why they do not cover. The reason is probably we thought some of the events which are required to build those detections are not ingested into SIM. Certain data sources which MITRE has recommended, those data sources are not used in the environment itself. Okay, so we were able to identify those gaps and identify the reasons for those gaps. Right now, sometimes what happens is and this is something which I observed during the mapping, the description of the techniques and sub-techniques sometimes are straightforward. Sometimes they are very tricky and very open-ended, open to interpretation. Okay. Now, in such cases, we have to take an educated judgment of understanding our environment and how that particular detection helps us in the environment to achieve any, let's say, the attack scenario detection. Okay. So based on that, we have to take an educated judgment and do the closest mapping, I would say. And that is the reason, the understanding of the framework itself is very important. Like I said, MITRE has 3 matrices: enterprise, mobile, ICS. Enterprise is further divided into preparatory tactics. That is nothing but the pre-attack, which I spoke about as part of version 7. Then you have the OS, which covers Mac, Windows, and Linux. Then you have network. They have introduced containers. Okay, way back in version 7, I don't think containers was a separate category under enterprise. Then they have also now introduced cloud, which covers O365, Azure AD, then SaaS, then infrastructure as a service, and also Google Workspace. Then I think mobile is also further divided into Android and iOS. Okay. Coming to the different sections that we see on the MITRE attack framework, you will see data sources. Okay. You will see attack groups, mitigations, and software. Okay. And to get started with the attack framework, if you are new to MITRE, MITRE portal gives you very good sections on how to get started. They have a getting started section. They have a section on working with attack. They have an FAQ section under all their resources, right? So that's where a lot of information is, present on the MITRE attack framework to get anyone started with the implementation. Now, let's say we have understood the structure. The question that comes to anybody's mind is, where do I begin and how, right? So that's where the analysis which I presented earlier, okay, makes sense. And based on that analysis, I would say that the top 5 tactics that we can focus based on the unique number of techniques and sub-techniques are, number 1, persistence; number 2, defense evasion; number 3, credential access; number 4, resource development; and number 5, recon. Okay. Now, if you look at these 5 tactics, they constitute at least 68% of unique number of sub-techniques and therefore, it helps to demonstrate to your leadership also against the coverage that you will get against the framework, right? Now, like I said, there are 17 techniques which appear into, 5 different tactics. So that also helps you to make sure that if you have addressed these 17 techniques as part of one particular tactic, it automatically gets covered as part of the other tactics where it is getting, duplicated. Now, if I have to tell you some examples of what are these 17 tactics, so valid account, I think we have already covered. The other technique, which is, I think, hijack execution flow, it appears 3 times under persistence, privilege escalations, and defense evasion tactics. Then scheduled task or job, which appears under persistence, privilege escalation, and execution. So like that, there are 17 which I have been able to identify through my analysis, which appear in at least more than 2, up to 4 different.
So just sorry to interrupt, but the pattern that I see here, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that is it the frequency of a technique occurring in these different tactics, or do you also have to correlate with any techniques that might be more frequently seen in your environment? Like, how do you prioritize between, so within these 5 tactics, for example, how do you prioritize for the techniques?
If you look at persistence and defense evasion, okay, these 2 are something where right from initial access to credential access and even till privilege escalation, most of the techniques get covered, even if you start with persistence and defense evasion. Okay. Now, you have already covered persistence and defense evasion. You don't have to worry about repeating those detection logic for, let's say credential access for the same technique and sub-technique. So that way your work automatically gets reduced because you have already done it. And all you have to do is remap it to the tactic called as credential access.
Yeah, please carry on.
Okay. Now, like I said, the next step is to do the mapping with the existing detections, right? And what I've seen is while we do the tactic techniques and sub-techniques mapping, many a times we forget or we ignore the data sources, which is very, very key component when it comes to the entire MITRE framework. The reason is if we don't get the right data sources, okay, if we don't get the right events from these data sources, okay, we will not be able to address the attack scenarios or the attack patterns which MITRE describes in their tactics, techniques, and sub-techniques, right? Another point to note is that the data source coverage is also a good parameter that we can use to demonstrate the framework implementation. It gives a view of what techniques and sub-techniques we can build, we cannot build, and why we cannot build, right? So like I said in my initial conversation, when we did the mapping for version 7, the important output that we got to know was the gaps, why there are gaps, and what to do to address those gaps. And we called out certain tactics, techniques, and sub-techniques as not applicable because those data points or those data sources were just not implemented in our security stack. And that became a recommendation to the management saying that, okay, if we have to implement, or if we have to get coverage against these attack scenarios, we need to implement additional security controls. So that is also one of the outputs which you can use and build a strong case if you want to bring relevant security controls, which probably may be missing in your environment.
Can you give an example of the data sources that you were talking about? Like, for example, if with the correlation?
Yeah, definitely. So let me take an example of Azure AD as a data source. And let me try to give an example where how did we do the mapping of a tactic, technique, and sub-technique to a SIM detection rule, right? Okay. So consider that you have an Azure AD as a data source and you're ingesting events from Azure AD, right? And you have an existing rule to detect brute force attempts in your environment, right? Now, in this case, when you are looking at brute force, you have a direct mapping to attack, which is tactic as a credential access and technique as a brute force. Now, under the brute force technique, you have different sub-techniques also. Okay. Now, for example, if you have, and it all depends on how you have defined the brute force logic so that you can help map it with the right sub-technique. So let's say you have login attempts associated with valid account using services like SSH, Telnet, or FTP or SMB. Then the sub-technique that you can very closely map to is the password guessing. Okay. Now, let's say if you have login attempts associated with failure events such as 4625, Windows event ID 4625, and you have it for multiple users. Okay. Now, depending on the organization size, we can set a threshold such as you want to consider it for 50 users or you want to consider it for 100 users. What should be time duration, either 5 minutes or whether 10 minutes. Okay. Now, depending on that, you have created this rule against Windows event ID 4625. Okay, and you have said that, okay, this is my brute force logic for 4625. Then most likely when that rule triggers, it is an indication of password spray. Okay, so you can map it to the password spray as a sub-technique under the brute force technique. So like I said earlier, sometimes it can be very tricky to map. And therefore, at the most, what we can do is map it to the closest technique and sub-technique based on our interpretation of the rule logic and the description that MITRE provides. Now, in today's case, if I consider most of the security vendors, whether it is a SIM or XDR or EDR or deception technology, most of the security vendors provide this mapping readily available as part of their out-of-the-box detection. So we now don't need to actually go and do manual mapping in our, let's say, SIM or XDR or EDR. Now we have to just make sure that, we have the mapping and we are using it correctly. So that's something which is up to us.
With the right data sources
in
mind. But I think, so this is just I think I'm digressing a little bit. It's slightly more nuanced, I think, in terms of, and I was going to ask about the product and how much help you end up getting from the product, like roughly when you're doing an implementation and like you said, right, there is a lot of this already available, a lot of this mapping already available out of the box. How much do you think products, especially SIM and other products today, provide support in terms of, roughly, actually, if you go ahead and implement or want to implement that for your organization, everything. So there are certain things in security where everything can be done in an automated fashion. But I'm sure there is a lot that also comes from the security team itself. So what do you think is the actual contribution, or how much do you think a security team should depend on these products when it comes to the actual implementation?
Yes, I think, like I said, the self-study is really important. Understanding of the framework is really important. What I have seen is many a times the vendors or the products that we see in our environment, a lot of times they are not mapped to the most current version. Okay, they will be either N-1 or N-2. And this is a question which I keep on asking my security vendors or partners. What is your frequency of updating your detections to the latest version? Okay. Many a times they don't have answers. Many a times they say it will come up in the next version.
Yes.
But yeah, I think vendors also know the importance of the attack framework, and they do their best to make sure that the latest version is supplied as part of their product version to their customers.
Yeah. I think, although I was just going to say, it almost sounded scientific the way you actually derived the mapping for the example, but in many cases, it could also be tricky, and it will take its own time for bringing it into the product and starting to use it. But I think from you have also led, security teams for organizations, and implementation is not the only thing when you are a leader, especially in security, and especially with a thing which is as comprehensive as MITRE and trying to actually be able to map it, doing this entire exercise, which can be huge for an organization. I'm sure you would have also faced this question that many of us in security teams do face, which is, what is the ROI, right? So what was the leadership expectation when you generally go ahead and implement a framework like the MITRE ATT&CK framework? And like, what was expected out of you? How did you actually go about and show them what the return was, what the value add was in terms of this?
Yeah, I think a lot of funny things happened at that point of time, but as part of my learning, what I'll try to do is I will try to answer it by basically I'll try to debunk some of the myths that management expects when we MITRE ATT&CK framework. I think that should answer the question. So myth number one is implementing MITRE ATT&CK or security tools that use this framework means organization is 100% protected from cyber attack.
Yay.
So I would say, yes, implementing MITRE ATT&CK framework means the organization is in a better position to detect a threat and at a very early stage of the attack. Okay. because we can collate all these indicators of attack. For example, it could be a phishing email, it could be some recon from a particular IP address on a particular port, brute force against a particular user account, etc. We can collect all this information, combine it with the threat intel, okay, and combine it with the attacker group's information, which is available on MITRE, okay, and narrow down onto which attack group probably is attempting to target the network. Okay, so this is one way of using the attack framework. It is definitely not going to protect you 100%, but definitely it is going to help you to be in a better position, detect early and take the actions before a big compromise or a data breach happens. Okay. Similarly, when you are doing, red team exercise or a breach attack simulation exercise. See, one of the objectives of these exercises is to simulate the actual attacks that the attacker would do if they want to compromise your environment, right?
Yeah.
So they very closely, imitate or simulate the attacker behavior. Now, if you are going to focus on the attacker groups and which tactics and sub-techniques they use, that is what MITRE describes in that attack group section, then definitely you know how the attack is going to span in your environment, right? For example, nowadays we hear a lot of attacks where the VPN gets compromised first. That is the first thing that happens. Okay. Now, how does the VPN get compromised? It is because of some user account, probably having their credentials leaked in some dark web forum. Okay, so that becomes a starting point. Use it on the VPN. VPN may or may not have a two-factor authentication. The attack is successful, right? Yeah. But if you use the same techniques and sub-techniques as part of your red team exercise, you are able to identify this as an attacker and take actions proactively rather than waiting for the actual attack to happen. So that's where, it is going to help organizations to make sure that you are well prepared to detect the attack at the early stage. The second myth I would like to talk about is that, to achieve 100% coverage, we must implement all techniques and sub-techniques. Okay. Now, I gave the quantitative analysis in my right? Now, you definitely cannot implement all of this. Okay. So implementing the detection that requires security relevant events from the right source is important. Okay. For example, if you want to implement, let's say you want to detect data obfuscation. Okay. And under data obfuscation, you want to detect steganography. Now, steganography, we know, is a very difficult thing to detect especially if you don't have packet inspection or SSL or TLS, inspection for the encrypted traffic in your environment. And we know how much of, network bandwidth or network latency issues users face when these components are enabled. Okay. So then these are some of the things you just cannot detect unless you are able to put in those controls like packet inspection or SSL TLS inspection. Another example is, initial access. Under initial access, you have something called as trusted relationship. Okay. So if an attacker's objective is to abuse that trusted relationship, okay, and then get into your network, what it means is they will first compromise your second or third party vendors or providers. Okay. Typically, these providers are not in the organizational security stack. They are not in the organization's policy, right? And you can still see a lot of business sensitive information which we exchange with these vendors over emails or maybe over the shared drives, etc. Now, in such cases, we just have to rely on a threat intelligence feed. Okay, so if that particular vendor, third party or a fourth party, whatever that is, okay, gets compromised, we should have that intel coming to us as part of threat intelligence feed that this particular vendor providing a particular service has been compromised, and therefore we can invoke our IR and reach out to the vendor. But when you're building the detection rules in your SIM, for example, you cannot build a detection rule for this trusted relationship because that vendor is not part of your organizational security stack, not part of your organizational policy frame. Right. So similarly, if you let's say if you have organizations which are highly regulated, they typically don't use public clouds, right? So the techniques and sub-techniques associated with cloud, such as cloud infrastructure discovery or cloud service discovery or modification to the cloud compute resources, misuse of unused cloud regions. So these are some of the techniques and sub-techniques associated with cloud, which are not applicable to that organization, and therefore they will be out of the MITRE implementation scope for them. Okay. So yes, there are a few techniques and sub-techniques that we cannot implement as part of the detection or security testing. And therefore, we should be cognizant about these before we start the MITRE journey. So definitely, if you are, definitely we cannot cover 100% of all the tactics and sub-techniques.
Right? Yeah, I think that's very well put and in a very structured format. I think some of the recent breaches we can clearly attribute to the trusted relationship that you were talking about. And it is only growing. It's a reliable technique for attackers and it will grow. It's very difficult to detect that. I think that's something that we're also seeing in other areas like supply chain security and other places where this the security that is there for your vendors is also something that is out of your control, right? So you can actually look at other things.
Yes. And I think the third myth that I want to cover is that if we don't implement attack framework, we cannot detect any cyber threat. Okay. So yes, MITRE is comprehensive. It is very granular, gives in-depth information about the adversary's behavior, but we can still detect these behaviors even if we don't have MITRE. Okay, because MITRE, like I said, came only in 2018. Prior to MITRE, we had Lockheed Martin's kill chain, which was widely used, and I think it is still in use because it's a little simpler and less complicated to understand the attack phase. So just because the organizations don't have attack framework doesn't mean they cannot detect the cyber threat. They can detect, it is just they have to make sure the right events reach the SIM and the detection logic is applied using those events.
So while we were on the topic of talking to the leadership and the other aspect of looking at it from, a 5,000, 10,000 foot view is also to understand the current state of security, because you already obviously have. So if you are implementing a framework, I'm going by the logic that because the framework is comprehensive and there is an inclination from the organization, of course, they are sensitive to security. They have those priorities in place, but also that it could be generally mid-sized to large-size organizations who are looking at taking it in a very structured format. Now, they would also be interested to look at the current state or current posture of security. And when you're going with this framework and implementing it, have you been able to I wouldn't say a quantitative, but the thing for the current state of security in your organization? Like, how do you measure? Can you measure it? Like, can you quantify and measure the state of security because you have implemented MITRE framework?
Yeah. So, see, in my experience, the MITRE attack framework does not give any kind of scoring, something like a NIST cybersecurity maturity framework does. Okay. But if you are getting assessed your security controls or posture against the NIST cybersecurity maturity assessment, definitely the assessor will consider what implementation of MITRE you've done in the organization, right? So you cannot use it directly as a scoring mechanism to come and arrive at a current state of security in your organization, but definitely you can derive certain KPIs which can help the organization to give that bigger picture. For example, as part of the SOC operations,
Mhm.
how many tactics, techniques, and sub-techniques did we see as part of the SIM alerts that have triggered in the last 30 years? Okay. As part of red team exercise or breach simulation exercise, how many techniques and sub-techniques were we able to simulate and test our security controls against? So these are certain parameters that we can derive, but definitely you cannot give a number like NIST cybersecurity assessment framework does.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah, I think, but it's still a lot of meaningful inputs to derive and to able to say that, hey, we were able to prevent so and so because, this controls were in place or this detection happened in a timely fashion.
Absolutely.
The part where once you have implemented the framework and you have adopted, completely implemented it to whatever extent was possible, have the right data sources. Now, you were earlier also talking about in the episode about, the products not being able to keep up with the speed of how MITRE attack framework itself is evolving and new attacks are coming in and all of that. How do you maintain and evolve it over time, given that some products may be, falling behind in terms of these updates or these mappings from time to time? And if there are new techniques emerging, we are seeing new breaches happening every time, in fact, on a weekly basis. And then there are new techniques coming up. So how do you do that? And is there a tactical aspect to it where you're also building those use cases to implement for the framework?
Yeah. See, I mean, when you have adopted a framework, the maintenance is basically part of the continuous improvement process. Okay. And with each version that MITRE releases, there are new techniques that get added, new sub-techniques that get added. There are existing ones which get modified. There are certain techniques, sub-techniques which are revoked or are deprecated. Okay. So if I have to take an example and compare version 8, which released in, I think, 2022, and the current version 13. Okay. If I take these two versions, between these two versions, there are 85 new techniques which are added to version 3. There are 459 techniques which are modified. 2 techniques are revoked and 1 technique is deprecated. Okay. Similarly, I remember when we started working with version 7, there was no technique associated with abuse of multi-factor authentication. That came only in version 11. And if you look back, certain attacks that have happened in the last 3-4 years, you would see that multi-factor authentication abuse has been on the rise, right? And it makes sense that MITRE has added it as part of their framework. So definitely we have to look at what changes MITRE is bringing after every version. And I also want to highlight that MITRE has something called as MITRE Security Attack Evaluation Program. Okay. Now this is the program where the security partners or vendors like Microsoft, CrowdStrike, or SentinelOne, Palo Alto, all of these well-known names in the security industry, they get their products assessed against certain simulation tests. Okay. And therefore, it is important to make sure that we work with a partner who has their products, assessed as part of this Ingenuity and have undergone this test, and they use the latest version of the framework. That's very important. From SIM perspective, like I said, we get the mapping for all the out-of-the-box detection, but we also have to make sure that they use the latest version, or at least N-1. And similarly, if we are making a custom detection, if we are building custom detections, then it is our responsibility to make sure that we map the techniques and sub-techniques correctly, and make sure with each version change, we see if there is any change and we remap it to the right ones. Now, a point to note here is that when security partners provide these mappings out of the box, what I have seen is these mappings are only at the technique level. They don't provide the mapping at the sub-technique level. So this is also something which we should keep in mind, especially when you are required to provide the coverage of your security control in your environment against the MITRE ATT&CK framework. It is important to note this and make sure that you give it at the technique level. Otherwise, you will struggle to give that to the sub-technique level, because the vendors currently don't have that mapping, many of them. Yeah. I think apart from these changes, we must also be watchful of new data sources, new campaigns, attack groups, and software which is used by attackers, because these are also getting added by MITRE in their versions from time to time. And therefore, if we are able to identify all these, I think the sustenance becomes very easy. So, I personally make it a point that whenever there is a release, I try to understand what are the differences between the two versions. So if there is a particular tactic, tactic is more or less static, I would say, but technique and sub-technique which is undergone a change. I can go back to my security partner or vendor and say that, hey, you know what, this is something which is new that has come up. Do you have a capability to prevent it, to detect it? Okay, you can talk to the vendors and make sure that they give it as part of the product whenever the next version comes, or whenever they release those in the environment.
Yeah, I think that clarifies it, for us. And I'm sure there'll be other communities, any other collaborations that you generally would need to be a part of. I know there is a MITRE ATT&CK community as well of people who are using it. But I'm sure other than that, are there other communities also in the industry where they try and exchange this kind of information where a technique hasn't come up yet, but the attack is already there, and you bring that up or update your systems?
I think one good thing or one good place to start is there is something called as Center for Threat Informed Defense.
Okay.
They give a lot of resources, and Red Canary. So the Red Canary has something called as Atomic Red Team tool, which we can use in our environment as part of the Red Team exercise. Similar to MITRE, I think Microsoft has also launched something called as Azure Threat Research Matrix. Right. So it is not exactly like a MITRE framework. It is very, very specific to Azure, but I think they have aligned it to the format of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So these are also some of the very good, sources apart from the blogs which are published on the MITRE ATT&CK framework that we can go through. MITRE also has their own GitHub using which we can, get those matrices in our environment. And if we have the capability to do certain automations and do certain dashboarding against those, we can, definitely do that through API integrations.
Yeah, cool. Thanks a lot for sharing so much information with us today, Shweta. And thanks for joining us in this episode. I think this has taken us through and clarified this whole complicated structure of MITRE ATT&CK framework, especially the implementation part of it, which is not very much talked about in mainstream, but I think I do see a lot of benefit that an organization can get, and not just in terms of compliance, but in terms of security overall, if they are able to implement it in the right spirit. Thanks a lot for joining us today and sharing so much information.
Thank you very much, Neelu. I think this was a wonderful discussion, and I hope the audience would enjoy listening to this podcast. And of course, if we can conduct some more podcasts on MITRE, I would be happy to do that.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Okay, thanks everyone for joining us today in this episode of Breakpoint. See you all in the next episode. Hey folks, that's all we had for today. I hope you enjoyed this one. Visit the podcast page for more such interesting episodes. You will find the speaker suggestions and other details in the show notes below. If you're interested in a security challenge of your own or would like to hear from a specific speaker or team, let me know in the comments below. Lastly, if you liked the episode, please go ahead, give it a thumbs up subscribe, and share with others in the community. It always means a lot when you do that. We'll see you in the next episode. Until then, Breakpoint signing off.